Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to continue to talk about chapter 5, and we're going to talk about some of the different concepts in sensation and perception that psychologists actually study. So this first idea is called absolute threshold. So how strong does something have to be? How strong does a stimulus or a signal or a sound have to be before that sensation actually occurs? And the absolute threshold is defined as how something that can be detected 50% of the time, and everybody has a different absolute threshold. And these are absolute thresholds that they have come up with for people. Some people have a really good sense of vision, some people have a very strong sense of smell, some people have a much more sensitive sense of taste and hearing and touch. So, some people are bothered by sounds more often than other people. So we're all very different in this absolute threshold. So we all have a different absolute threshold. But psychologists have come up with what is the absolute quietest sound that somebody can hear, the farthest thing away that somebody can actually see, and 50% of the time. So not everybody can see it. Some people can see it. So that's the absolute threshold. So, and they say here, for vision, a candle flame from 30 miles away. That's hard to imagine. I don't know. I live fairly near Piestua Peak now. I was trying to say that right. And I do see people with flashlights up on top of the mountain. I don't know how far away that is. I don't think it's 30 miles. But we can see things really far away. We might not actually be able to interpret what we're seeing, but we can definitely see light really long distances. Hearing the tick of a clock at 20 feet, how quiet, that's of course if everything is quiet. A teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. So if you put a teaspoon of sugar in 3 gallons of water, apparently we wouldn't taste it. So psychologists study, how strong does something have to be before we actually notice it. The difference threshold has to be how different does something have to be before we notice that it's changed. So if they wanted to reduce the amount of salt in Lay's potato chips, how much can they reduce it before we notice that it tastes different? Same thing with Coca-Cola. If they're going to reduce the amount of sugar, how much can they reduce it before we start to notice that that tastes different? Temperature in the summertime when we're hot, how much do we have to turn down that AC to actually feel cooler? If we ask somebody to turn the radio down because it's too loud, or turn it up because we can't hear it, how much do they have to turn it up before we can tell that it's louder? That's the difference threshold. Sensory adaptation is something we're all really very familiar with. So when something is the same all the time, we don't notice it anymore. If we see something that's kind of unusual, it sort of draws our attention, and we pay attention to it for a bit till we figure out what it is, and then we don't pay attention to it anymore because it's not interesting to us anymore. So that's sensory adaptation. At first we see it, we're interested, and then we lose interest after we figured it out. So our senses actually adapt to our environment. If you walk into a friend's house that has cats and a litter box inside, you might notice that smell right away. And it might bother you for a bit, but if you like that friend, you hang out for a while and you don't really notice that anymore. Your senses adapt to it. At first, you sort of alerted to it. Does this mean something? Is it dangerous? Is it important? And then when we figure out what it is, we're not so concerned about it anymore and we forget about it. That's sensory adaptation. If you're a person that puts Post-its different places to try to remember things, if you keep them in the same place all the time, you kind of get used to seeing them there all the time. You start to ignore them. That's sensory adaptation. If you get into a super cold swimming pool, which I don't know why people would do, you typically get used to that cold after a bit, and it doesn't bother you as much. At first, it really bothers you, but after that, you get used to it. So that's sensory adaptation. So what about attention, and what happens when we miss something? Maybe other people saw something and we totally missed it. How does that actually happen? So what we perceive has a lot to do with what we're paying attention to, what we're motivated to see, what we're motivated to hear, what we're motivated to feel. This picture down here with the gorilla is kind of an example. I posted a video about inattentional blindness, which is where people totally missed something that was pretty big, a gorilla, because they were so focused on something else. And what happens in the video is there's a group of people passing around a basketball, and the person who's watching that video is asked to count the number of passes that basketball makes, how many people catch it and pass it on, and to really focus on that. And then a gorilla just wanders into the video and does crazy stuff, and you would think, how could you miss a big gorilla? But the majority of people will actually miss the gorilla because they're so focused on counting and watching that basketball. That's what we call inattentional blindness. That's when we're focused on only one aspect of a situation. And if we have a new baby at home, some of you have kids at home, we're sort of hyper focused on that baby and making sure that that baby is okay. And so we are very in tune to hearing if that baby is crying or in distress or has woken up and needs us. So if we have a new baby, we're much more focused on that. Now, if your friends come over and they've never had a baby, they're not necessarily focused on that. You might hear the baby crying and they don't hear it at all. So what we hear and what we see has a lot to do with what we're interested in and what we're concerned about and what we're paying attention to. This is an example of, what people pay attention to sometimes and how that might reveal a little bit more about them than what they're actually seeing. So this is a really old thing. I don't know if you guys remember this. Obviously, this is a VHS tape from the 80s probably, but you guys probably saw The Little Mermaid. And there was this mom that was super up in arms back in the 80s. She was on the news talking about how Disney put a phallic symbol in the Little Mermaid image here. She wasn't concerned about the little scantily outfit that the Little Mermaid's wearing here, but she thought that this was a phallic symbol. And if you don't know what a phallic symbol is, it's a penis. And Freud used that term phallic symbol to represent that. And she thought that the Disney animators put this in here intentionally to somehow, I don't know, influence little kids. I don't know why. But what does that say about her? So Freud would say maybe she was sexually repressed. Maybe she's seeing things, projecting her own desires onto this. Because sometimes a tower is just a tower. Freud would say sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes it does mean something, but other times it means absolutely nothing. So sometimes what we see is much more of a reflection on who we are than what the object actually is. I think Disney did actually change that picture, but I don't think it could have been a rogue animator that put something in there, but I think that's unlikely. I think mostly it is just what that person was projecting and what they expected to see or wanted to see. So what about subliminal messages? Subliminal messages were big back in the 80s, and they thought that different rock bands were putting subliminal messages in their albums to try to manipulate us, make us become Satanists or something. I don't remember. But the idea of subliminal messages is actually kind of interesting. Does our mind actually perceive things that we're not aware of? Can they flash a thing about eating popcorn in front of us so briefly that we don't even recognize that we've seen it? And will it cause us to rush out and go buy popcorn? And there has been a lot of psychological research on this. When I went to ASU, I had a professor in cognitive psychology who actually studied this, and he had this little machine. This was probably before we had a lot of computers, but the machine would flash something in front of you for less than a second. And you didn't even realize that you had seen something, but then he would show you other images and you could actually identify which image it was that they flashed in front of you, even though you had not physically processed it and actually seen it. So our mind does actually process information that we're not aware of. And you think about it, our senses take in all this information from the outside world that we're not necessarily paying attention to unless it becomes really important to us. So our brain does take in information, process it, and kind of just gets rid of it if it doesn't think it's important, and it alerts us if it does think that information is important. So we do process information even though we're not consciously aware of processing that information. So there have been studies about subliminal messages and can we manipulate people through subliminal messages. And what we found is that our mind does process information even though we're not aware of it. And sometimes if it's a negative or a positive image, it could sort of change our emotional state really briefly, but it doesn't manipulate us or force us to go out and do different things. It's just it's such a brief thing. But it's interesting that our brain actually does process that information. So this is just a review of some of these concepts about sensation and perception. So sensation is information coming from our senses. Transduction is that process of converting sense information into neurological signals that can be perceived by the brain. And perception is a psychological process where we make sense of that information that's coming in from our senses. So the absolute threshold is how strong does something have to be in order for us to see it. A difference threshold is how different can something be before we notice that there's a difference. And then sensory adaptation is just that our senses adapt to stuff that doesn't change, that it's interesting at first, but once we figured out what it is, we don't pay attention to it anymore. Our receptors just quit responding to it. So that's it about the different sensation concepts in the chapter.